Jasmine Rowe entered Aurelia & Co. without a sound, her steps quiet against the polished stone tiles. She wore a faded gray coat and carried a canvas tote bag, nothing that screamed wealth, power, or influence. And that was the point. Jasmine wasn't just another customer. She was the founder. But today, she came not as a CEO, but as an observer. It was a quarterly test she never announced. No cameras, no entourage, no security detail shadowing her movements. Just Jasmine, her thoughts, and the raw, unfiltered reality of what her brand had become. She had built Aurelia & Co. on the promise of inclusivity, of elegance designed to embrace rather than exclude, of beauty offered as belonging, not as judgment. But recent whispers had unsettled her, stories of arrogance, of cold shoulders turned toward the wrong kind of buyer, of favoritism and indifference that had crept into the flagship location. And Jasmine Rowe had always known that whispers mattered. They were the earliest warnings of cracks in the foundation. She had to see for herself. The first red flag appeared before she had even taken 3 steps inside. A young associate behind the counter glanced up from her phone, blinked once, and then, without a word, dropped her eyes back to the glowing screen. No greeting, no offer of help, not even the instinctive smile that should have been muscle memory in a brand like this. The kind of detail that would mean nothing on paper, but in practice meant everything. The second sign cut deeper. A pair of suited shoppers walked in moments later, voices bright, shoes polished, coats perfectly pressed. Within seconds, the energy shifted. 2 associates moved as if rehearsed, offering immediate consultations, guiding them with warm tones toward the emerald section, voices rising in manufactured excitement. The room seemed to exhale for them. And yet Jasmine, standing just steps away, remained invisible. She drifted toward the diamond display, fingers brushing the cool edge of the glass, eyes fixed not on the jewelry, but on the people. A whispered exchange caught her ear, a low laugh between 2 clerks, not cruel but careless, like her presence was more a placeholder than a person. And then came the look from the man in the slim black suit, clearly the manager. His eyes flicked up, met hers for half a second, traveled down her coat, her shoes, her tote, and dismissed her with a subtle arch of indifference before he turned, animated, to assist someone else. The message was clear. She wasn't their idea of a customer. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't storm out. She didn't pull rank or correct them. That wasn't her way. Instead, she moved deliberately, slowly, continuing to browse with the quiet patience of someone who had learned long ago that the truest character of a team reveals itself when no one feels watched. She made mental notes, sharp, specific, unforgettable. Every ignored glance, every judgmental look, every missed opportunity to do the one thing this brand was supposed to be known for, respect. The jewelry sparkled in the cases, the soft jazz played overhead, the velvet trays were perfectly aligned. Everything in the store radiated polish. Everything except the people. They thought she didn't matter, that she was just another face. What they didn't know was that she was the one person who mattered most. 8 hours earlier, Jasmine sat by the window of a small downtown cafe, stirring a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Outside, the early morning traffic moved with purpose, people heading somewhere, always on the clock. But Jasmine wasn't in a hurry. She hadn't been in a long time, not since she stopped running the day-to-day and chose to observe instead. Sometimes the best way to understand a company was to step back and watch it from the edges. On the tablet beside her, an internal report blinked open. It wasn't long, 4 short complaints, all from the same store. Different voices, same pattern, distant staff, quiet judgments, a sense of being sized up before being welcomed. No raised voices, no scandal, just a slow erosion of what she'd spent years building. And it was happening at the store she had once considered their gold standard. She closed the report and looked at her reflection in the window. No makeup, no jewelry, no armor. Just soft lines, gray at her temples, and eyes that had seen enough to know when something subtle was also something serious. She slid her tablet into a canvas tote and rose without a word. Aurelia and Coer was only a few blocks away. She walked slowly, her mind already rehearsing possibilities. Misunderstood customers, poor training, or maybe something deeper. Maybe the culture had drifted too far from its roots. That happened when success grew too fast. When Polish started to matter more than people. She didn't expect red carpet treatment. That wasn't the goal. But she did expect recognition, not of who she was, but of the values she had infused into every store, every policy, every training manual. She wanted to see if those values were still alive. By the time she reached the storefront, the lights were on. The cases gleamed, the floors were spotless. But something in the air felt flat, performed, staged. She paused at the door for a breath, then stepped inside. It didn't take long. One associate noticed her, blinked once, and turned away. Another offered a smile meant more for politeness than welcome. Jasmine walked in silence, letting the store reveal itself. Two sharply dressed shoppers entered minutes later and were instantly met with warmth, laughter, offers of help. Jasmine stood in the same room and felt a different temperature. She didn't judge anyone immediately. She never did. But as she moved toward the rings, the same ones she'd helped design 3 years ago, she watched how invisible she became. It wasn't malice, just something colder. Indifference dressed up as elegance. She lingered by the display, tracing the glass lightly with her fingertips as if admiring the cut of the diamonds, though her eyes were fixed elsewhere. She noticed how a sales associate, standing barely a few feet away, glanced at her reflection in the case, then deliberately turned to tidy an already perfect tray of bracelets. Another staff member adjusted a necklace on a velvet bust, lips pressed into a polite smile. But not for her. It was the kind of neglect that wasn't loud, wasn't rude, but hollowed out the very idea of welcome. The silence grew louder with every passing second, especially when compared to the scene unfolding only a few feet away. The manager, face animated and voice full of honey, leaned toward a well-dressed couple as though they were royalty. His laughter rose above the soft jazz, punctuated with lines about exclusive access and pieces reserved only for our most valued clientele. A champagne flute appeared in the woman's hand as if by magic, an unspoken performance of importance. For Jasmine, there was nothing. No warmth, no gesture, not even the courtesy of acknowledgement, just absence. And in that quiet indifference, she found her answer. Jasmine stopped near a row of stacked eternity bands and let her gaze wander, not to the jewelry, but to the people behind the counter. One associate checked the time on her phone, clearly bored. Another adjusted a display without once looking up. The manager, now animated in conversation with a well-dressed couple, had completely erased Jasmine from her awareness. The contrast was sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. She stepped closer to the central showcase, letting her hand hover near a ring she'd once approved in a product meeting. It was one of their best sellers. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had helped choose it for women like her. Modern, understated, quietly powerful. And now, she couldn't even get eye contact. The room buzzed for others. Soft laughter, delicate gestures, a glass of sparkling water offered without request. For Jasmine, silence, as if her presence lacked permission, as if she needed to audition for worth. She didn't shift her posture, didn't try to look more worthy. That was never the test. The real test was for them, to see who they welcomed by instinct and who they overlooked without thinking. In the luxury space, warmth wasn't optional. It was a promise. And promises weren't made selectively. She walked to the edge of the boutique, paused near the cufflinks, a section she knew most of their staff rarely touched. It was quieter here, more revealing. A junior associate glanced her way, then bent down to realign a box without speaking. Not rude, just absent. Jasmine watched her and thought, This isn't failure by accident. It's failure by neglect. The staff didn't realize they were being evaluated not on product knowledge or dress code, but on what couldn't be scripted: the feel of the space, the silent cues, who they chose to see, and who they quietly pushed out of frame. Jasmine had built Aurelia & Co. to resist exactly this kind of atmosphere, where prestige replaced presence, and presentation came before people. She wasn't angry, not yet. But disappointment settled in her chest like dust. Light, persistent, hard to ignore. Her steps carried her slowly through the boutique, every polished surface reflecting not just the jewelry, but the hollowness behind the service. She brushed her hand across the edge of a velvet display, not to admire, but to feel something tangible, something real, after the emptiness of the human exchange. Each clerk moved in their well-rehearsed patterns, the polite nods reserved for the affluent, the careful gestures saved for those worth impressing. Jasmine had trained her teams to see everyone, but here she felt unseen in a space that was supposed to embody her vision. That irony cut deeper than any harsh word could. She turned slowly, her face unreadable, and made her way toward the exit. The team barely noticed. They were too busy performing hospitality for those they believed mattered. What they didn't know was that the woman they had chosen to overlook had once written their welcome script. And now, she would be the one rewriting it. As the automatic doors swished closed behind her, the taste of air outside felt mercifully real. Cool, unfiltered, unarranged. Jasmine's heart felt lighter, not because of relief, but because the weight of witnessing had passed. She paused for just a moment on the sidewalk, the city's hum filling the space where polite pretense had reigned only minutes before. That hum was not background noise, it was urgency, a reminder that culture, unexamined, becomes complacency. She didn't immediately head back to her regular schedule. Instead, she wandered into a nearby art gallery where sharp angles and bold colors demanded attention without apology. She studied each piece and allowed their raw honesty to guide her. A sculpture of bent steel that suggested resilience, a painting of muted tones erupting into chaos, all reminding her how fragile beauty becomes when it masks indifference. In that gallery, she felt the metaphor of her own brand mirrored back at her. Time passed quietly. Jasmine finally raised her phone, thumb hovering above the icon for email. She opened a blank message and typed a subject line she knew would cause ripples. Culture found. Urgent reset required. Beneath it, her words didn't reach for finesse or protocol. They were straightforward. Clarify our values by tomorrow. Summit attendance mandatory. No need for drama. Culture didn't change with sentiment. It changed with clarity. At a cafe across the street, she settled into a corner seat. The barista, seeing the resolve in her eyes, poured her a refill without asking. That small gesture felt like a gesture witnessed, acknowledged. She scribbled bullet points. Measure warmth, reward empathy, eliminate privilege bias. Then she prioritized them. The top businesses didn't run on sparkle, they ran on care, consistently applied. As she sipped her tea, she wondered how many of her team still saw her as the face they promoted, never knowing the founder could appear so unnoticeably, so human. That thought gave her solace. She closed her eyes and imagined the team receiving a notification, a silent directive to remember people mattered. No scripts, no whispers, just humanity. When she finally stood, she didn't feel burdened. She felt resolved, like someone who just reopened a door that had stuck. The street sounds greeted her again, and this time, they didn't feel urgent. They felt hopeful. Mail sent. She walked the long way back to headquarters, past the park where she used to sketch design concepts during the brand's earliest days, past the bookstore that had hosted Aurelia's very first press launch back when they were a one-line collection and she had worn a thrifted blazer just to look official. It was memory-laced ground, humble, sacred. And it reminded her who she was building for. Not the polished few, but the many who came in quietly, hoping to feel beautiful for once. At the entrance to her office tower, she paused for a moment. A young intern stood there, nervous, juggling a cardboard tray of coffee cups while still making the effort to hold the heavy glass door open for her. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another passerby. But Jasmine noticed. She offered a soft smile and stepped inside, the simple courtesy striking her with more weight than all the velvet trays and crystal glasses she had seen that morning. It was unperformed decency, the kind that couldn't be faked, and it reminded her that true culture lived in moments no one prepared for. She moved through the lobby quietly, her flats tapping softly against the polished floor, and ascended to her office. The corridors buzzed faintly with routine, emails being answered, calls taken, meetings scheduled. But Jasmine's presence carried a different kind of gravity, one that no one fully understood yet. She entered her office, shut the door firmly behind her, and lowered the blinds, drawing a line between distraction and resolve. What strikes me here is how much weight Jasmine gave to that small, unnoticed act of kindness. It's powerful because it proves that real culture isn't defined by staged hospitality or rehearsed smiles. It's defined by the instinctive choices we make when no one is watching. And honestly, I think this is something we often miss, not just in business, but in life. We prepare for the big moments, presentations, speeches, polished impressions, but the truth is, people measure us by the small ones. That nervous intern holding a door without expecting thanks lived Aurelia's values more than the polished staff who had forgotten them. For me, that's the heart of leadership. Noticing the small, ordinary gestures and realizing they're not small at all. The room fell into stillness. She set down her canvas tote, pulled her laptop onto the desk, and opened a fresh document. At the top, she typed 2 words, second founding. It wasn't branding. It wasn't a campaign to polish the company's image. It was something rawer, something truer. A recalibration of everything Aurelia had once promised and almost lost. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, steady but deliberate. She began with the only truth that mattered. We lost something when we got too polished. I want it back. Not the shine, the soul. From there, the words poured out in clean, unembellished strokes. She wrote about training that emphasized presence over performance, about incentives that rewarded humility instead of hierarchy, about ensuring that no guest would ever again feel invisible in a space that was built for beauty. The document grew as the hours passed. Sunlight faded behind the blinds, replaced by the muted glow of her desk lamp, but Jasmine didn't notice the time. She wasn't writing policy. She was writing intention, a new compass, one that pointed back to the heart of why Aurelia & Co. had ever mattered. When the words were finished, she didn't sign her name. She didn't need to. The message wasn't about her authority. It was about the culture she expected everyone to live. The following morning, her decision reverberated across the company. At 7 a.m., sharp, the subject line "Second Founding" appeared in every inbox, unfiltered and unmistakable. There was no preamble, no design, no gloss, just 3 short paragraphs and a single link to a mandatory gathering. The tone was plain-spoken but undeniable, like a bell rung in a quiet hall. We will not measure excellence by polish anymore. We will measure it by presence. And honestly, that line hit me hard. Because it's not just about luxury brands, it's about life. How often do we polish ourselves for appearances, while forgetting the simple presence that makes people feel seen? Culture, whether in a company or in everyday life, isn't defined by slogans or surface sparkle. It's revealed in how we treat someone who looks like they don't belong. That's the test. And Jasmine's reminder feels bigger than retail. It feels like something we all need to hear. What do you think? Have you ever walked into a space where you immediately felt judged by how you looked instead of welcomed for who you were? By 9 a.m., murmurs rippled through departments. Was something wrong? Were jobs at risk? No one knew exactly. But Jasmine hadn't written to scold. She'd written to remind. And the reminder was working. Store managers read and reread. Executives opened the document titled Second Founding and found themselves underlining whole sentences, especially this one. If our spaces only feel warm to those who look expensive, then we've forgotten why we exist. At noon, Jasmine stepped onto the atrium stage, not in heels, not in a blazer, but in the same gray coat and flats she'd worn the day before. The room quieted. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried because people knew she only spoke when something mattered. She told them about her visit, not as a trap, but as a truth. Not one face paled. Every face turned inward. "This isn't about a store," she said gently. "It's about a slip, a small drift toward performance, and I want us to return to meaning." She introduced a new initiative, Project Aurelia Again. It wasn't a campaign. It was a standard reset. Stores would undergo a hospitality integrity audit, not just customer surveys, but observational feedback from people who didn't fit the assumed mold. Each location would nominate one empathy ambassador. Leadership promotions would now require peer reviews that spoke directly to how inclusive their behavior felt, behind the scenes, not just on the floor. Jasmine wasn't interested in optics. She was interested in operating systems. If the warmth wasn't instinctive, then it wasn't real. And if it wasn't real, it didn't belong at Aurelia. As the meeting ended, people didn't clap. They stood quietly, some blinking back emotion, others already thinking of their teams. The room dispersed not in panic, but in purpose. Jasmine stayed behind, watching from a balcony as her staff filtered back to their departments, sleeves rolled, posture changed. It wasn't about fear. It was about pride, what they'd almost lost and what they could now rebuild, not shinier, truer. That evening, long after the office had emptied and the last hallway light clicked off, Jasmine remained seated in her corner room. The city stretched wide beneath her windows. Her laptop glowed softly in the dark. On screen, drafts of revised onboarding materials, new language guidelines, a realigned mission statement, all still in progress, but alive, breathing. The work of resurrection never happened in fanfare. It lived in quiet hours, when no one else was watching. She glanced once more at the document she'd named Second Founding, now bookmarked by her team, cited in internal meetings, already rippling outward. But it was never meant to be a doctrine. It was a mirror. And what mattered now was how people chose to stand in front of it. On her desk sat the very first Aurelia catalog. The cover still made her smile, simple, hand-lettered, earnest. The paper was thin, the ink slightly uneven, and yet it carried more weight than any glossy magazine the company had produced since. It had cost almost nothing to print, but everything to believe in. She remembered the night she and two friends had stayed up until dawn, folding and binding each copy by hand, convinced that if even one customer understood the message, it would be worth it. Back then, beauty wasn't a transaction. It wasn't staged behind velvet ropes or reserved for polished appearances. Beauty was a language. It said, "You matter. Not your wallet. Not your image. You." And that was the legacy she was determined to reclaim. Jasmine stood slowly, her body tired but her resolve unshaken, and reached for the faded gray coat she'd worn during the visit. She let her fingers run along its worn seams, frayed just enough to remind her of the years it had been with her. It wasn't a statement piece. It was a symbol of humility, of persistence, of the kind of woman Aurelia was always meant to welcome, the ones who walked in quietly, who didn't need to prove themselves to deserve warmth. That coat had carried her through beginnings that felt fragile, through milestones that felt impossible, and now, through a night of reckoning that demanded a return to soul. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the light switch. For a long moment she looked back at the office, the sketches, the handwritten notes, the catalog, and let the silence deepen around her. Then, softly, almost like a prayer, she whispered the words that had once launched the entire brand, Words she hadn't said aloud in years. Elegance, for everyone. Her lips curved into a small smile, not because the work was finished, but because it had finally begun again. Tomorrow the stores would still gleam, the diamonds would still shine. But beneath the polish, something real had been restored. Not a new product, not a marketing trend, a promise, a vow made years ago, now reborn. And here's what I think. This part of Jasmine's journey is the most powerful of all, because it reminds us that leadership is not about announcements or applause. It's about returning to the vows we once made, the reasons we started in the first place. For me, her gray coat is more than fabric. It's proof that humility can carry more weight than luxury ever will. And I believe that's the kind of culture shift the world needs, not just in business, but in how we treat each other every day. Because real beauty, real leadership, is not in how brightly we shine when everyone is watching, but in how faithfully we act when no one is. This is a fictional story. Any resemblance to real people, brands, or events is purely coincidental. If you work in customer service, lead a team, or shape a brand, take a closer look at your culture. What feels like a small moment may be shaping everything. If this story resonated, leave a comment, hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more.
Still.